Yeah, how surprised were you as a international relations expert? How surprised were you that Putin actually invaded Ukraine?
I think that it was not surprising in some ways, and in other ways it was, right? I mean, so this is one of the largest uses of force we've seen in Europe since 1945.
Hmm.
So in that sense, it shocks a lot of people. On the other hand, you could see that this was somewhat predictable. And again, war is not a everyday occurrence between different dyads, right? Two countries. But the fact is that there were aspects of this that were highly predictable. And here's how I would think about it, right? Clearly, it's not a good thing. And I think it's important to say that from the beginning, from a classical liberal perspective or an American perspective, or from the perspective of international norms and international laws. But the reason why we could think about it as being somewhat predictable is because even though it's unjustified, you could understand why it happened. And a big part of that is because of the fact that Russian national interests dictate that they should be concerned about the expansion of Western and American power eastward. Mm-hmm. And so when the United States and others kept talking about NATO expansion, whether at the with the Bucharest Declaration in 2014, which welcomed Georgia and Ukraine and their aspirations for membership, or it was the interoperability exercises that you've seen between Western countries and Ukraine, the arms sales, or simply the constant chatter about how, well, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but eventually we see Ukraine and Georgia being part of NATO. It's understandable that would provoke what we call in international relations the security dilemma, which is when you try to do things that improve your security or the security of your allies, it stimulates a counter response where other states are concerned about that. And what you end up doing is can get an escalation. And what we saw here was an escalation of this competition. And so while, again, it's unjustified, you can understand why it happened.
Right. I guess before we get into some of what you're talking about there, especially about NATO and the EU and all that, how surprised are you that the Russian military, and, we're barely into this. I mean, everybody, I think we're used to wars that take a weekend, right? Because that's what the first Gulf War did, and major offensives, they don't go on like they did in World War II or Vietnam even. But we're very early in this. But how surprised are you that Ukraine is kind of pushing back the way they are, and that the Soviet army, I'm part of the problem here, the Russian army is doing so poorly?
Well, I think that it's not unexpected to see states have optimistic or rosy predictions about how well they'll do on the battlefield.
Are you kidding? Like, what, don't we have 20 years of American, just in the 21st century of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the old notion that, the troops will be home by Christmas, right? So it's not even a 20th century issue. But it's easy to have optimistic and rosy expectations. Now, some of that is obviously for public consumption, right? Because it's very difficult to say, hey, in 2001, well, we're going into Afghanistan and it's going to be 20 years, but buckle up, American public, right? People, so some of it is for public consumption, but a lot of it is because of the fact that people actually believe it, right? They, in a way, since I'm talking to Reason, right, they're high on their own supply, if you will. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that creates, that's going to create some, I think, concern at home about, and you're seeing this with some of the Russian protests that we've seen, concerned that, well, how long is this war going to happen? What are going to be the types of casualties and costs that they will see? So I think that is not unexpected. What is interesting is that you've seen, I think, a real lack of, and again, the battlefield is pretty opaque. So I think that's important for us to say, and we should have some humility about understanding what's actually happening on the battlefield. But I think that there seemed to have been a clear lack of appropriate planning and an appreciation for the logistical challenges that you get, particularly because Ukraine is a large country, right? It's not as big as the United States or Russia or China, but it's a large country. And you're talking about pretty long lines of communication, what are called GLOCs, right? Ground lines of communication. And so those logistical challenges are there. And so when you saw things like paratroopers or thunder runs, right, where they can outrun the logistics, that creates real challenges for the Russians on the battlefield, particularly in the face of maybe either expected or possibly unexpected resistance by the Ukrainians.
Is there, and again, we're early on this, and Russia has one of the most massive militaries on the planet, but are they also kind of rusty? And, is their leadership actually good? I mean, what are the fights that Russia has been in that have really sharpened their ability? I guess another way of putting it, do they have the equivalent of Donald Rumsfeld, running their defense department?
Well, I mean, again, we should be careful in a couple of different directions here, right? One, assuming that the Russians are a massive military superpower. The fact is that Russia has spent, about a tenth of what the United States spends every year on its military. Right. And its economy is about the size of a mid-major European country, right, let alone,
I think it's like the equivalent of Texas's GDP.
Right, exactly.
Like that. Yeah.
So we have to be careful about inflating the capabilities of Russia. On the other hand, they have fought. They fought in Chechnya, for example. They fought in Georgia, fought in Syria. So they do have some capabilities that are a little more battle hardened than say the Chinese are, right? Where the Chinese have not had that type of battle testing, and so you could expect the difficulties that states have when it's been a while, right? But again, the Russians have fought recently, but this is a different type of conflict in many ways than those others. And so we should expect, for example, that there will be organizational learning that will happen as the war proceeds. And this is why I think it's very careful. We should be very careful about getting too enthusiastic or excited about us understanding what the end of this will be.
Right.
I think a lot of the Twitterazzi, for example, has really been out there really gushing about Ukrainian bravery. And I get that. I too, am excited to see people standing up against this aggression. But we shouldn't get too excited that this is necessarily going to end well for Ukrainians. I think they're going to get a good dousing, not a good one in a normative sense, but a serious dousing of cold water as Russia learns, as it reconstitutes itself and starts to adjust on the battlefield, especially because, like I think you alluded to, and this is where I think that you were both right and off a little bit. This is where you were right in that they are much bigger and more powerful than Ukraine. The balance of power favors Russia in terms of that local balance of power. And then the question is what is the balance of will? Now that matters, but that ultimate tip of the spear capability, particularly when the Russians, which I think they will do, will have air supremacy, and when they can start to exert the firepower that they have relative to Ukraine, in a way, at a certain point, no amount of bravery is going to be able to overcome that, right? So you think about the classic example of martial bravery, right, which is the Battle of Thermopylae, right, where the 300 and others Spartans stood up against the Persians. Well, that could hold for a long time, and it's the stuff of lore. And we may be talking about the Ukrainians in the way that we talk about brave defenders, small defenders, Davids against Goliaths of the past. But not everything turns out so well in the terms of David defeating Goliath. If you think about the Melians, for example, fighting back against the Athenians, at the end of the day, it didn't end so well for those crying justice against the kind of realpolitik of the other side.